Marriage equality changed a lot of lives for the better, but it also had some unintended consequences. This New York Times opinion piece reminded me of a conversation that is rarely heard. Let's get into it. Hello, I'm Dr. Badiee, psychologist and professor, and today I want to talk about this New York Times opinion piece. And essentially, the crux of the article is that there's less support for LGBTQ plus people than before. And so when I first heard about it, I was thinking, oh, maybe I'm going to hear about Project 2025 and how that contributes, or the rise of Christian nationalism, or the growing of authoritarianism in the US. Nope, it's us queers. Well, according to the article. To be fair, the author does briefly mention culture war politics, but there's far more time spent on asking what queer activists did wrong, and specifically how expanding gay to queer and more people identifying as queer blurred marriage equality activists' initial message, which was that sexual orientation is innate and cannot be changed. And so the author argues that this has contributed to the declining acceptance for our people. So I'm going to break down his argument by applying Black, queer, and decolonial scholarship to discuss three things. One, the history of the word queer. Two, the colonial function of marriage. And three, respectability politics. If we're going to ask whether the word queer is the problem, we need to first understand what it means and where the term actually came from. So let's talk about queer. The author cites Halpern's definition of queerness as anti normative. And if you look into Halpern's work, specifically the anti normative piece was against norms of heterosexuality, what's called heteronormativity. Bell Hooks reimagined queerness by framing it as survival not just against heteronormativity, but against a white supremacist capitalist patriarchy. So I'm going to use Bell Hooks' definition of queer, which is that queer is not about who you're having sex with, but queer is about being about the self that is at odds with everything around it and has to invent and create and find a place to speak and to thrive and to live. So going back to the opinion piece, the author mentions that the term queer became popular in the 1990s. But let's go back a little further because queer's origins in the US actually go way further back. So in the US, the term queer was popularized in the 1890s specifically as a tool of anti Black criminalization. So, an article from Haley states that queer was essentially defined as uncontrollable Black bodies that could only be interpreted and governed through policing and incarceration. In other words, their bodies in and of themselves were considered deviant, were considered queer in this negative context. And that origin makes it particularly important to include Black queer perspectives because a lot of times when queerness is discussed, it's talked about from a very white lens. And in this opinion piece, the author correctly states that Queer Nation, an organization based in New York, advocated for using queer in their manifesto. And part of that was to convey the anger at how they were being treated. And I do agree with the author that this set up an us versus them dynamic because, as you can see in this page from the original manifesto, it says, I hate straights. So it does sort of set up this dichotomy between people that are heterosexual and people that are queer. And the author also points to the rise of queer theory and how that contributed to the idea of queer as anti-normative. But Black queer scholars like Bell Hooks and others critiqued both queer nations tactics and queer theory that the author describes. So, Black queer studies scholar Kathy Owen stated that queer politics relied only on challenging power norms when it comes to sexuality, which created that dichotomy that we were talking about between heterosexual and queer. So rather than relying on one category, Cohen argues for an intersectional perspective, which means that we are not just looking at sexual norms, we are looking at multiple aspects of our identity and how those relate to power. So, if we return to Bell Hook's definition of queer as being at odds with everything around oneself, and we look at that from an intersectional perspective, we can examine someone like a woman of color who is on welfare, who is receiving state support. And she might be heterosexual, but her sexual choices are viewed by society as deviant, as immoral, and as not worthy of receiving state support. And so, if we are to look at queerness as being at odds with everything, she could be considered to be at odds with everything around her, even though she's heterosexual. In the opinion piece, the author mentions that the expansiveness of queer makes it easy for anyone to adopt it, which I agree. Where I disagree with the author is that queer can be generalized as a fad or an aesthetic. I mean, sure, anything can be performative, right? Including heterosexuality. But characterizing queerness completely as a superficial trend is just not accurate. For many of us, queerness isn't an aesthetic. We actually take our commitment to dismantle systems of power very, very seriously. The author argues that this expansive definition of queer is a confusion that gay people just can't afford right now, especially if they're living in red states or are in very religious communities. But rather than policing who counts as queer, Cohen actually asserts that queer should be even more inclusive, as long as that inclusivity is grounded in intersectionality, that idea of acknowledging multiple identities. In fact, Cohen stated that queer's radical potential actually comes from building broader intersectional coalitions. And honestly, building solidarity across marginalized groups seems more important than ever as the gap between the wealthiest people and all the rest of us is widening. So that's the first disagreement I have with the article. The second concerns marriage itself. The author mentions that the legalization of gay marriage transformed his sense of self worth, showing him that he could live openly as a gay person. And this isn't unusual. Self worth is tied to marriage for a lot of us. But have you ever stopped to ask why? I mean, most of us do need connection to be healthy, sure. But why marriage specifically? Well, marriage has a very specific role in colonial societies like the US. But before we get into that, I need to give some context and talk about how people in the US were, and in some ways continue to be, categorized. So in the US, whiteness has been constructed in relation to a racialized, non monogamous other. And essentially, this resulted in two categories. And the two categories were civilized, the white folk, and barbaric, which were the racialized other. And by racialized, I mean they were assigned a race, whereas white people were considered the default and ideal. So, what does civilized mean? Civilized meant white, Christian, heterosexual, patriarchal, nuclear family. And that was deemed worthy of citizenship. In contrast, those who were barbaric, which included racialized groups like Black and Indigenous people, were denied citizenship. So, by defining civilized with the nuclear family, and specifically getting married, marriage became one of the ways that in the US we decided who belonged and who didn't. And in the US, these categories were specifically based on ideas about the superiority of whiteness and of Christianity. You can see this in anti polygamy campaigns and in how Christian monogamy was contrasted with Muslim harems. So Christians were cast as civilized, whereas Muslims were backwards. And also in the US, becoming accepted as American essentially means being accepted as white. So, monogamous marriage basically helped to police the boundaries of whiteness through laws and taboos against interracial relationships. So, for example, at one point in history, white women who married non white immigrants could lose their citizenship. It's a big deal. The racial aspect of marriage also becomes obvious when we look at Mormon history. Mormons' non monogamy practices essentially made them considered race traitors. And in the Supreme Court, they actually argued that non monogamy, yeah, that's fine for those primitive brown and black people, but Mormons, you should know better. Check out this political ad from 1870 called A Mormon Family Goes Out for a Walk. As you can see, there's a frail looking man who's leading wives of different races and nationalities, essentially casting Mormons as a racialized group, as not necessarily fully white. They were betraying whiteness. Take a look at this political ad from 1879, which is Uncle Sam sharing a huge bed with troublesome bedfellows that include Mormons, Chinese, indigenous, and Black people in the ad. So essentially, all these groups were being lumped together as deviant and were being kicked out of Uncle Sam's bed. And Mormons actually only became recognized legally when they stopped non monogamy. So essentially, monogamy made them white. I wish I could say that these were isolated examples, but they reflected a broader pattern. Another example is in the early 1900s when former President Teddy Roosevelt promoted the assimilation of European immigrants whose whiteness was contested, linking Americanness to forming heterosexual families. In other words, heteronormativity became the pathway to whiteness. So, to put all those pieces together, in the US, marriage has functioned by linking race, sexuality, and monogamy to determine who was considered civilized, who belonged, and who could become a citizen. In other words, marriage wasn't just about legal rights, it was also about defining who counted as fully human and worthy of belonging. I know what you're thinking. That's so that history is so far away. It's so distant. Doesn't apply to today. And I hear that. But listen to the language in this New York Times opinion piece. Marriage taught the author that gayness could be normal and could be every bit as dignified and human as being straight. Did you catch that? Dignified and human. These word choices aren't an accident. Marriage still determines who is fully human and respectable. As the author says, legalized gay marriage meant that he didn't have to live in society's margins. But what if your own body places you in the margins? What if your body is just classified as deviant? Which leads to my final point, respectability politics. The entire opinion piece is essentially an argument for respectability politics, which is the idea that marginalized groups adopt dominant norms to avoid discrimination and gain status. And it makes sense. For some people, being respectable is a matter of survival. They feel that they have to do that in order to exist in this society. I want to take a quick pause here to say if you're enjoying this kind of psychology informed, evidence based analysis, I really appreciate it if you'd like this video and subscribe. It helps more people find this work. Now, going back, let's talk about why respectability politics is a problem. It puts the burden on marginalized groups to police ourselves. when we're already bearing the weight of oppression. And only those of us who can conform to dominant norms and do are considered worthy of protection. This excludes the most vulnerable among us, those whose bodies are already marked as deviant, like our trans and non binary siblings. To really address oppression, we have to address it at its systemic roots. Cultural and religious prejudices run deep, and respectability doesn't necessarily result in acceptance, which is actually a point the author makes when he states that conservative Christians only reluctantly accepted marriage equality and now have walked back those positions. In fact, the author states that conservative Christians who previously supported gay marriage are increasingly alarmed at the LGBTQ plus movement's lack of clear principles. I disagree. Queer is a principle, a commitment to liberation for everyone, not just the people willing or able to follow the dominant rules. But if queer politics isn't driving anti LGBTQ plus attitudes, what is? We're going to talk about that in the next video. Have a great day.